the fact that he was deaf in one ear. He cannot hear in his right ear, so he only had one ear to work with. That's why a lot of the early Beach Boys recordings are only in mono. Mono being that you can only really hear it in one ear. It doesn't pan in multiple speakers like stereo did when the Beatles recorded Sgt. Pepper in '67. But if you listen to Beach Boys records like Beach Boys Today or Summer Days and Summer Nights, which is 1965, 2 years removed from the days of I Get Around, which is January of '64, or Surfin' USA, or Little Deuce Coupe from '63, you'll see that there's a gradual chain of progression there. And not many people take this into account. They just tend to associate the Beach Boys with surfing, cars, and chicks. And that's fine. It's an ideal that I would argue developed out of the 1950s kind of car culture and, post-World War II baby boomer generation, the nuclear family, the dad works 9 to 5, the mom's at home, and then the kids kind of go to school and they do all that. It's the typical American thing. These are ideals that were reinforced by the Beach Boys in the early 60s and other groups like Jan and Dean, obviously great surf guitar player Dick Dale. But if you listen to a song like, there's a myriad of songs on Beach Boys Today, like one song recorded in late '64 that I would shout out, and I wish I could play an audio clip of it, but I would just recommend you guys listen to it, is When I Grow Up to Be a Man. And this is recorded in August of '64, but released in '65 on Beach Boys Today. The recording style on that song, I mean, as far as the production goes, the drums, the way that they're panned in the mix, it's Dennis Wilson, Beach Boys, and also preface the fact that the Beach Boys consisted at this time of Brian Wilson, brother Brian Wilson on bass and keyboards and vocals, Carl Wilson on vocals and guitar, Dennis Wilson on vocals and drums, Mike Love on vocals, who was a cousin of them, Stan Love, and Kevin Love for the Cleveland Cavaliers. It was all related there. And then you had Al Jardine, an old friend who was a big folk music fan. So there's a lot of immersion of different sounds that go into this early Beach Boys sound. But you'll notice that a song like that is very revolutionary, especially for '64, because it just shows you how far they came in such a short span of time. And the fact that they were so prolific early on it's insane, the fact that they were to grow, they grew the way they did in such a short amount of time. It's something we marvel at the Beatles for, but I think really if you want like a perfect culmination of what like peak Beach Boys is, and it's not surf stuff, it's a 1966 album that I would argue is better than Sgt. Pepper, which Rolling Stone magazine has ranked as the #1 record of all time. It's Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds, in my opinion, regardless of where you come from, and one of the tags that we did use to preface this show is universality. Pet Sounds is an album of universal themes. It's an album of themes of loneliness, isolation, depression, not fitting in. But with that, Wilson's ear for sound, the way he worked with session musicians like Glenn Campbell and Carol Kay and Al DeLory and just Hal Blaine on drums, just a myriad of people that he worked with, because it's pretty much considered a Brian Wilson solo album with the Beach Boys name. They actually only sing and play, or they sing on every song on the record except the 2 instrumentals, Let's Get Away from Our Pet Sounds. But they only play on one song collectively, which is That's Not Me, which is another beautiful psychedelic rock song. I mean, this album, not only was it a trailblazer for how we perceive pop music moving forward, and I don't know, who's listening here, what your relationship with the Beach Boys and music is, but I would argue that if there's one thing that I'd want anybody to take away from this today, it's that this is a record that signifies a drastic shift away. It is the culmination of everything that they had worked towards and then gradually progressed to with each ensuing release of the Beach Boys canon. It is their 12th studio album, and it is 1966. The Beach Boys formed in 1961, so in the span of 5+ years, they put out 6 records. They put out 12 records, average of like 2-3 albums a year. I mean, prolific is definitely something that was in their nature. But what it shows me, and when I really first heard this record when I was 14, and this gets back to what the subject of our show was, it was our musical journeys. Right. The first time I heard this record, my entire perception of the Beach Boys changed. Because, and after that, I always just penned them as like, surf group. They wrote songs about cars and girls and all these other things and the beach, even though none of them were actually surfers. It totally altered my perception on the Beach Boys, and it totally gave me a newfound respect for Brian Wilson, given the fact that he, at this time, was suffering from auditory hallucinations, experimenting with the likes of LSD and, drugs which have very much damaged his mental psyche to this day. If you've seen an interview with Brian Wilson today, he's a shell of the man he once was. But Pet Sounds is the culmination of everything. It's the pop album. I think it's the greatest pop album ever, and its influence can be heard from the spears of alternative and indie rock to dream pop and psychedelic music. I mean, if you don't need any more credit than this, Paul McCartney, obviously bass player, multi-instrumentalist, one of the two co-songwriters, Lennon McCartney, the Beatles. It's called God Only Knows, which is a song, again, I wish I could play a clip of here because I think that's arguably the greatest song ever written, with one of the most beautiful arrangements of all time via Brian Wilson and lyrics with his songwriting partner at the time, Tony Asher. I think that song, Paul McCartney has said that it's his favorite song of all time. It's one of the most beautiful things he's ever heard in his life. And Scott, if there's one thing I would say to you is please listen to that song. You'll have an entirely different perception.
Well, you'll have to test it to me on YouTube. Now, let me go over, you talk about my musical journey. Let me say a few things that might, for a lot of you people in the audience that are a little bit older than you, okay, and that are closer to my age. Once upon a time, there used to be called 8-track tapes, okay? From there, we moved on to cassette tapes, okay? Then you get the reality, and now we've gotten satellite radio, we've got DVDs, we got CDs, whatever the case may be. Now, you want to talk about the age difference between us folks, okay? I don't even think you'll get this right, okay? You remember Howard Cosell, right?
Of course I do.
Okay, do you remember that he used to have a entertainment show?
Yeah, you told me this, I believe last week we were talking about that he had his own show. You know,
do you remember who the guest was?
I don't.
First musical group. This is what, folks, I'm going on record that this is not no trick. This is a treat for you, for a lot of you older listeners out there, okay? Who was the first group that he had on his entertainment show?
Tell me.
The Bay City Rollers.
Bay City Rollers, yeah.
How about that? See, I do know
from
a little bit about
from
music.
Sweden.
And now, when I used to have my 8-track...
I'm sorry, Scotland.
Yeah,
continue.
there you go. That's okay. So, and once upon a time, I used to listen to the Bee Gees, okay, on my 8-track tape. So when we talk about technology, I can't tell you how much money I invested in the 8-track tapes, cassette tapes, until we get to all this other business. Who would have thought about YouTube? The only thing we ever knew back then was picture tubes, not TVs, okay? So when you look at, like you say, the evolution of where music has gone throughout the years, you know, I think the one thing I've always been able to get connected with the music industry is when I do go to concerts. I love Elton John. He's the one that wrote that song about Candle in the Wind.
Yeah, he wrote it.
With Princess Diana. But you know,
originally about Marilyn Monroe in 73 when that came out.
But then when Princess Diana passed away. See, you know where I was back then when Princess Diana died? I was here in Fort Lauderdale covering the Lions and the Miami Dolphins once upon a time, and that's when Princess Diana...
August of 97, I believe, right?
No, I think it was later that year. I don't think they played a preseason. I have to look it up, but you know, sometimes you associate certain events where you were with certain songs. I mean, and it's like anything when you take a test, okay? Word association or anywhere. So when you talk about the fact that I've gone to many concerts, the primary concert venue I had in Metro Detroit was really mainly the Palace of Auburn Hills. I would go to a place called Meadowbrook Music Hall, which is the outdoor version of the amphitheater, and I've gone to other places too. So, you know, it's not like I'm oblivious to the whole thing, but it just depends on how you really deliver it and where you're at, what your taste is. I mean, I would love to one day have a program here where we can compare our top 25 artists, and I would be very intrigued about where you would be. Now, on my YouTube thing here, I can tell you right now I have them sectioned off like long drives, short drives, long walks, short walks, you know, and have different. So it's always, you kind of shuffle the deck a little bit.
And yeah, the mediums at which I'll never forget my dad telling me the first album he got on an 8-track tape was actually Elvis live at Madison Square Garden in 1972, and that's actually a crucial part of my musical journey because as far as where my taste lied as a child, I mean, I grew up in the back seat. My dad was a maintenance manager for Budget Trucks for 30 plus years.
Right.
And every week we had a new rental car. And every week we would always tell each other, like, hey, this better have Sirius XM radio on it because we would always listen to one channel and one channel only unless we weren't listening to, like, the 60s and the 70s. It was Elvis radio. From when I was a kid to when I was a wee child to about maybe 10, 11 years old, the biggest musical influence in my life, and I don't play any instruments, so using influence is maybe a stretch, was Elvis Presley. My dad grew up the biggest Elvis Presley fan in the world, and by the time I was 10, I had read about 100 books, I had seen a million pictures, and I had heard almost everything that he had ever recorded because my dad immersed me into that world of Elvis. And one of the beautiful things about that was the foundation for what my musical taste was. Now, Elvis, I mean, you can go a million different directions with Elvis. He didn't write his own songs, which is something, as I've gotten older and gotten into the art of collecting vinyl, and hey, I mean, I got 120 plus records in my room, so I love me some vinyl, as they like to say it.
Right.
But, I can appreciate Elvis, obviously, for the magnanimous kind of presence he was on stage, and, obviously the power of his voice, even all the way through his death in 1977, when he was very out of shape and, not the same performer he was. But, Elvis, I mean, we always have things in our lives, and music is one of those things with me that we tend to associate with memories of days of yesteryear. And Elvis, I mean, I have a fantastic relationship with my father, and I think that bond really started with two things: the New York Yankees, which again I'm not a fan of, and also Elvis Presley. But those two things, whenever I hear Elvis Presley or I think of Elvis Presley, the first thing that comes to my mind is my dad. And I mean, that, like, whether that was when we went to Graceland when I was a 10-year-old kid, or I'm listening to Hound Dog in the backseat of a car when I'm like a 7-year-old, and this is a funny story, singing the song It Hurts Me, which is, for any Bob Dylan fans out there, was written by Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels did play electric bass on the Bob Dylan country record, Nashville Skyline.
Well, you know where I was when Elvis Presley died? I was actually at an overnight camp out in Michigan. In fact, when he died, I remember another historical American event when Richard Nixon resigned as president of the United States because of the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, so Nixon was August 8th of 74, Elvis August 16th, 1977.
I was out there, I think, in camp for 10 days, and those two synonymous events took place. In fact, I'll even go a step further. You want to talk about where you were at certain points. When I had back surgery, Michael Jackson and Farrah Fawcett died when I was in the hospital at Holy Cross there in Fort Lauderdale. Mm-hmm. So it's amazing. Every time I try to look up when Michael Jackson and Farrah Fawcett died, because I need medical records, okay, I always go back to them. And you being a baseball guy can appreciate this. When I tore my ankle skiing was the same day Billy Martin died on Christmas Day.
89, correct?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So events, when you tie them in. But yeah, have you ever been to Memphis at all?
I have. And I'll tell this story. This is very important in my musical journey. So this is about late September of 2006. I turned 10 the next month, and my dad, at this point, I remember there used to be a place by my house called Circuit City. I'm sure you remember Circuit City, one off of Sample Road by me in Coral Springs, and we went one day, and I would immediately, because again I had already had this relationship with Elvis. I'll never forget. This was like maybe early 2005. I'm 7-8 years old at the time, and we go inside, and the first place me and my sister would bolt, other than the CDs, was the back of the store, because in the back of the store, on the back wall, like you would see when they would try to sell you radios that would go and you could hook up to your car, there was Sirius XM radio, and what me and my sister would always do is we would change the channel to channel 13, and at the time channel 13, which I believe it's 19 now, was Elvis Radio,
right,
which had launched in July of 2004, the same day that Marlon Brando actually passed away. I believe it was like July 2nd, 2004. But and we would listen to Elvis songs, and we would, I mean, it's an odd thing as a kid to request it, but we would go to my dad. We begged him one day, and he dropped the $100, and he bought the Sirius radio. You remember those old kind of things that you just mount to your car, and he has a little radar like that. So we kind of had the same kind of thing. So we mounts it to the car, and I'm like, you know what channel to put on? Channel 13, and we'll drive home, and we just hear like Elvis all the time. They'll play. I remember they used to play like our Friday nights. We would go out to eat every Friday night, same restaurant, Carlucci's in Coconut Creek off Winston Park, and we would drive home, and what would be on every Friday night was an Elvis Presley concert from the touring years, which is 69 to 77, and we would listen to those, and those were fundamental for us, because me and my sister, to this day, we still listen to Elvis Presley. Even if our musical tastes have evolved beyond that, we still have this almost like colonial kind of loyalist kind of thing where we're just like, we're never going to get rid of Elvis. It's never going to be out of our heads because it's so fundamental to who we are as people. Not by the way he lived his life, but just growing up, we grew up with that music, even if it was past our time or before our time. But one thing my dad showed me as a kid, and this is maybe other than Elvis, the most significant group of artists in my life, and I really can't wait to ask your take on this, is the Beatles. When I was a kid,